Meta pulls to 6 1.5. There is something haunting about silence, not the silence of sleep, but the silence of being forgotten. Meta paused 6 1.5. So many of them had no tombstones, no statues, only whispers in archives, faded letters, unmarked graves. Meta paused to 6 1.5. But they breathed, they loved, they waited at windows, they smiled when summoned, then broke when dismissed. Meta paused to secutive 1.5. Some gave their entire youth and were rewarded with distance. Meta paused to 6 1.5. Some bore children who grew up never knowing their mother's name, never calling her mama in public, never inheriting a throne, only her eyes and her silence. Meta paused to 6 1.5. In portraits they appear beside kings, but never in front. Their eyes tell stories that paint cannot hide, of love given freely and taken away without warning. Meta paused to 6 1.5. Sometimes they were sisters to queens, sometimes they were rivals, sometimes both. Meta paused to 6 1.0. They watched the world through lace curtains, heard decisions made without them, dressed in silk but walked in shadows. Meta paused to 6 1.5. And yet they endured. They learned to survive palaces, to survive politics, to survive love. Meta paused to 6 1.5. There was strength in their softness, courage in their quiet, power in their presence. Meta paused to 6 1.5. You may not see them in history's headlines, but they were there, in every room, behind every throne, beside every crown. Meta paused to 6 1.5. And now, you've heard them, you've felt them, you've honored them. Meta paused to 6 1.5. So sleep now, let the velvet hush wrap around you, let the palace fade away, let their stories rest with you. Meta paused to 6 1.5. For in remembering them, you give them what history never did, peace. 6 1.5. Imagine the silence after the doors closed, the gowns hung still, the laughter gone, the candles burned low, and she sat alone. In Denmark there was Caroline Matilda. She married a king, but loved his doctor. Her love was real. Her punishment? Exile. Her death? Early. Her story? Nearly erased. In Prussia, women were sent to court, not for love, but for arrangement. They were gifts, tokens, favours. In every palace there was a hallway she could not enter, a decision she could not make, a name she could not give her child. She lived by rules written by men, spoken by queens, enforced by silence. Some mistresses saw their kings every day, yet never truly knew them. Some were never touched, only admired. Some were touched too much, then thrown away. They learned to listen, to flatter, to wait, to fade quietly. But still, some wrote poetry, some painted, some fought in their own quiet ways. They passed knowledge in whispers. They raised children who questioned crowns. They smiled in portraits, but left thoughts in margins. You might not find them in your textbooks, but their stories are under the ink, in the shadows of kings, in the cracks of thrones. They remind us, power is not always loud, love is not always safe, history is not always fair. Close your eyes now, let the velvet curtains fall, let the cold halls grow quiet, let their stories drift into silence, with you. Sleep, and remember, they lived, they mattered, and they are not forgotten. Poet Meta pause vote sex 1.5 flows poet coast on poet. They were whispered about in corridors, painted in portraits that hid more than they showed, celebrated and scorned. Always on display, never truly seen. Vote poet Meta pause vote 1.5 poet. Some lived in secret apartments behind palace walls, rooms with golden mirrors and locked doors. They saw kings without their crowns, and knew truths no queen was told. Vote, 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 meta, pause, vote, flows, vote, 1.0. Their power was fragile. One wrong word, one jealous rival, and they were gone. Vote, 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 meta, pause, vote, sex, vote, 1.5 vote. In Spain, Maria Teresa de Vallabriga loved the prince, but she was never welcomed. She watched as her children were taken, raised by strangers, far from her arms. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, vote, 1.5 vote. In Austria, Archduchess Maria Christina despaired a royal match. She married for love, but that love came of exile, far from Vienna's glittering halls. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. Some mistresses never sought the crown. They only wanted to be loved, to be chosen once above all else. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. Instead they learned how to smile when abandoned, how to bow when dismissed, how to disappear gracefully. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 5 vote. One danced for hours just to be noticed. Another wrote letters the king never read. Another waited outside the banquet hall until her name was forgotten. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. They wore silks, but they walked on eggshells. They had titles, but not freedom. They had lovers, but not promises. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, and they aged. They vanished. Vote, vote, meta, R6, pause, vote, sex, 1.0 vote. Replaced, erased, silenced. Vote, meta, pause, vote, sex. Some turned to religion, others to poetry. Some died alone in country houses, far from the palaces where they once laughed. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. But they are still with us, in the corners of old paintings, in the margins of letters, in the bloodlines of kings. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. They were more than mistresses. They were women, with minds, with dreams, with voices. Vote, vote, meta, pause, vote, sex, 1.5 vote. And though history tried to forget them, tonight you remembered. Sleep now. Let their stories settle in your heart and in your dreams. Hashtag meta sex 1.5. Close your eyes, rest your hands, and let us begin. Hashtag meta sex 1.5. In the grand courts of Europe, kings ruled with gold, steel, and ceremony. Hashtag meta sex 1.0. But their hearts often wandered beyond their queens. Hashtag meta sex 1.0. Royal marriages were about power, not love. Hashtag meta sex found love, or something like it, elsewhere. Hashtag meta sex 1.0. Some mistresses were chosen for their wit, others for their laughter. Some were barely 16. Some were mothers, widows, or dancers. Many were born poor, but found themselves in silk beds beside royalty. Hashtag meta sex 1.5. In de la Vallière, she fell in love with Louis XIV, not for power, not for gold, but for his eyes, his words. She gave him children. She waited, but soon the king grew cold. Louise retired to a convent, alone, heartbroken. Hashtag meta sex 1.5. Then came Madame de Montespan, fierce, witty, dazzling. She ruled the court, not with a crown, but with perfume, secrets, and laughter. But even she fell, accused of witchcraft, replaced by someone younger. The world of royal mistresses was not kind. #meta sex 1.5. In England there was Nell Gwyn, an orange seller turned actress. She caught the eye of Charles II. She was funny, warm, adored by the people. But she was never accepted by the court, never truly safe. When the king died, she begged not to be thrown into poverty. #meta sex 1.5. Some mistresses became powerful. Madame de Pompadour was more than a lover. She advised King Louis XV. She read books, met philosophers, sponsored artists. But she was always reminded she had no crown. #meta 1.5. Others had no choice. They were forced, manipulated, used. In Russian palaces and German courts, in silence, forgotten by history. #meta sex 1.5. Behind their smiles there were tears. Behind silk gowns